She stood at my door with a little cactus in her hand and that practiced look of a woman who finally ran out of options. 6 months ago, she was telling her friends I was the problem. She was redecorating my house, replacing my curtains, moving my late husband's plants so she could fit a grill. Now here she was, no makeup, no edge, nothing left but a knocked-on door and a grocery store succulent. I didn't open the door wide, but I did let her talk. And what she said changed everything, including what I understood about why she'd been so ugly to me in the first place.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. My name is Lorraine. I am 68 years old, and I want to start by telling you about the house because none of what happened makes sense without it. I built it. Not as a figure of speech. I actually built it. Me and Marcus and a contractor named Floyd who charged us less than he should have because Marcus had fixed his car twice for free. That was Marcus. He never let a favor go unreturned, and people always found ways to return the kindness. We bought the lot in the late 80s when this part of town still had patches of open land between the older houses. We drew the floor plan at our kitchen table. I still have the napkin somewhere, Marcus's handwriting, my corrections in the margin. He died at 44, a fall at a job site. Quick, they said, as if that was supposed to help. I had 2 boys to finish raising. Darius was 11, Kevin was 15. I had the house, a sewing machine, and enough stubbornness to outlast grief. So that's what I did. I worked out of my home for 22 years. Alterations, formal wear, custom pieces. Women came to me the way they used to go to a family doctor, because they trusted me and because I never talked about their bodies the way other people did. I learned things about this neighborhood through hemlines and waistbands that I never would have learned any other way. By the time both boys were grown, the house was paid for. Mine. Every wall, every window latch, every square foot of the garden. I planted what I wanted, arranged it how I liked, and kept the kitchen the way Marcus and I had set it up together, which meant I knew exactly where everything was without looking. That mattered more than I realized until someone started moving things. Kevin went to Atlanta. Good job, steady woman. 2 kids I don't see nearly enough. He calls every Sunday without fail, which is more than most. Darius stayed closer. And Darius, bless him, has always been the one people could get to. Not because he's weak exactly, more like he's built for warmth. He wants everyone comfortable, wants the temperature in the room to stay easy. Marcus was the same way. It's a beautiful quality until someone figures out how to use it. I should have seen it coming. I think some part of me did. He called me on a Tuesday night, which was unusual. Darius is a Sunday caller like his brother. "Mom, I want you to meet somebody." I said, "How serious?" He laughed. "I'm not saying yet." But he was grinning when they walked through my door 2 weeks later. I could tell before Simone even spoke. He had that look Marcus used to get, like he was proud of something he wasn't sure he deserved. Simone was pretty, polished in that particular way that takes real effort and is designed to look effortless. She wore a silk blouse tucked into wide-leg trousers and small gold earrings. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "I have heard so much about you. This house is gorgeous." I said thank you and meant it, because in that moment I did appreciate the compliment. We had dinner. Simone talked easily, asked questions about my sewing work, laughed at the right times, touched Darius's arm when she agreed with something he said. She was good at it. That's what I kept thinking. She was very good at it. But I noticed things. She asked about the house twice, the lot value, whether I'd had it appraised recently, what the neighborhood was doing. She framed them as curiosity. Maybe they were, but she asked about property twice in one dinner, and she never asked about Marcus once. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Women learn to ask about property because nobody else teaches us to. Maybe she was just smart. I let it go. 6 months later, Darius called on a Sunday. Mom, I need to tell you something. And then we got married, just us at the courthouse. We didn't want a big thing. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. I said, "Are you happy?" He said, "I really am, Mom." I said, "Then I'm glad for you." And I was. I just wished I'd been there. And I noticed that he called me after, not before. They came to the house on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. Darius brought flowers, sunflowers, which he knows I love, and Simone carried a bakery box, lemon cake, my favorite. I remember thinking, they've prepared for this conversation. We sat in the living room, the one with the big window that looks out onto the front garden. Marcus's lemon tree was visible through the glass, just starting to bud. I had my coffee. They had theirs. Darius did most of the talking. The rent on their place had gone up significantly. They were trying to save for a house. Living with me for a year or two would let them build a down payment without draining everything they had. It would be good for all of us. He wouldn't be so far. I wouldn't be alone in the evenings. He said, "It'll be like when I was in college and I'd come home for summers. Except permanent. You like that, right?" I smiled at him because I did like those summers. That was true. I looked at Simone. She was nodding along, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and patient. But her eyes were doing something different. They were moving around the room. Not rudely. You wouldn't have called it rude. More like an inventory. Like she was measuring what was here and how she might fit into it differently than I had arranged it. I brushed that off. I told myself it was just the way some people look when they're nervous. "All right," I said. "Let's try it." Darius reached over and hugged me. Simone thanked me and squeezed my hand. She said, "I promise we'll make this work." I believed her. That's the part I keep coming back to. I actually believed her. Hey? The first thing I noticed was the balcony. I keep plants out there. Have for 30 years. Succulents, a few herbs, some old cacti that Marcus collected because he said they were resilient and beautiful and didn't need anyone to fuss over them. He said that about a lot of things he liked. 2 weeks after Darius and Simone moved in, I came home from visiting my neighbor Dolores, and the whole balcony had been rearranged. The cacti were in a corner away from the sun. The herb pots were stacked against the wall. In the center of the balcony, where my oldest cactus used to sit, the one Marcus bought from a roadside stand in New Mexico the year before he died, there was a folded outdoor rug still in its plastic wrap. I found Simone in the living room reading something on her tablet. "Simone," I said, "the plants on the balcony. They need the light. Those cacti will die in that corner." She didn't look up right away. When she did, she said, "Oh, they looked crowded. I needed room to put that rug out." Then she looked back at her screen. I stood there a moment. Then I said, "Could you ask me before you move my things?" She said, "Of course. Sorry about that." But her tone was the tone of someone who has already decided they're not going to change anything. 2 days later, there was a new coffee table in the living room. Modern, metal-legged, glass-topped. It sat exactly where a round wooden table had sat for 15 years. The one Marcus and I found at an estate sale and refinished ourselves, the one with the ring mark from the mug he used every morning. That table was gone. I found it in the hallway storage closet. I asked Darius about it that evening. I kept my voice even. I asked if they could have talked to me before replacing furniture in my own living room. He looked genuinely surprised, like it hadn't occurred to him that I would mind. "Mom, it's just a table." Simone wanted to freshen things up a little. It's her home too, right? Her home too. That phrase settled somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I want you to understand what my kitchen meant to me before I tell you what happened to it. Marcus and I designed that kitchen together. We argued for 3 days about where the window should go. I won, and he told everyone the window was his idea. That was also Marcus. I knew where everything was by feel. I could cook in that kitchen with my eyes closed. I had cooked in that kitchen through grief and holidays and the slow, ordinary years in between. My recipe box, a tin box with index cards in my own handwriting, and some in Marcus's and a few in my mother's, who died in 2008, lived on the second shelf above the stove. One afternoon, I came home from my doctor's appointment, and the kitchen had been reorganized. Not everything, just enough. The pots had been moved. The cabinet that held my mixing bowls had been shifted to what Simone apparently thought was a better location. The top shelf, where I stored things I used daily, had been cleared to make room for a standing mixer still in the box. My recipe tin was in a drawer, under a box of Simone's protein powder. I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long moment. I found Simone in the bedroom on a phone call. I waited. When she came out, I told her, quietly, that I needed the kitchen to stay the way it was because I used it every day and I knew it a certain way. She said, "Lorraine, the layout wasn't efficient. I just reorganized a couple things. It's fine." I said, "It's my kitchen." She said, "Of course it is," and walked past me. That night I moved everything back. Every pot, every bowl, every spice jar. I moved my recipe tin back to the second shelf above the stove. The next morning, it was in the drawer again, under the protein powder. I did not say anything. I moved it back. I didn't say a word, but something changed in me that night. Something went quiet and decided. I stopped hoping this was a misunderstanding. I went to the grocery store on a Friday afternoon and forgot my reusable bags in the car. By the time I came back in through the side door, I could hear voices in the living room. Simone and two women I didn't know. I stood just inside the kitchen. I wasn't hiding. I just hadn't announced myself yet. "I don't know how you manage it," one of the women said, "living with his mother. That would drive me absolutely insane." Simone made a sound, a small, performative exhale. "It's a lot. She's in everything, you know. Like I can't rearrange a drawer without a whole conversation about it." The other woman said, "Is she at least helpful?" "She watches us." Simone's voice dropped a little, just enough to make it feel confidential, which meant she wasn't being careful. "I feel like I can't breathe in my own home. Every time I do anything, I'm getting the look. How much longer do you think you'll be there?" "Not long, hopefully. I'm so tired of explaining myself, what I eat, when I eat it. She'll literally come in the kitchen when I'm cooking and just hover." "Have you said anything to Darius?" "He tries to smooth it over, but honestly, she just doesn't want to share her space. I think she liked being the only woman in that house. It's territorial." I was still holding my grocery bags. I set them down on the counter because my hands had started to shake a little. I had never hovered. I'd never demanded explanations about anyone's food. I had stayed out of their way, moved my things back in silence, and asked 2 questions in 6 weeks. 2. And she was in my living room telling her friends I was the problem. I stood at that counter for a long time, long enough for them to switch topics, long enough for me to decide I was not going to walk in there and say a word. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed. I thought about what Marcus used to say when something got to him. "Don't spend your anger until you know what you're buying." I put my grocery bags away. I made dinner. I sat at the table with Darius and Simone, and I was polite, and I said almost nothing, and I started paying very close attention to everything. I waited 2 days. I picked my moment carefully, a Sunday evening when Simone had gone to take a bath and Darius was reading in the living room. I sat across from him. I told him what I had heard. I kept it factual. I did not perform distress. I told him what Simone had said, word for word, as closely as I could. Darius listened. He set his book down. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, I felt something hopeful, that he was actually hearing me. Then he said, "Mom, Did you ever think that maybe she was just venting to her friends? That doesn't mean she actually feels that way, I said. She said she was tired of explaining herself. Darius, I've asked her 2 things in 6 weeks. He said, she's adjusting. It's hard for her too. I said, I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to acknowledge that what she said was not fair. Then Simone appeared in the hallway. I don't know how long she'd been standing there. She came into the room quietly, sat beside Darius, and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just been told something hurtful. I don't know exactly what you heard, she said, but I've been trying my best here. It hasn't been easy for me either. Darius looked at me. I said, Simone, I heard exactly what you said. You told your friends I hover and I'm territorial. She said softly, I was having a hard day. I didn't mean... Darius cut in. His voice had an edge I had never heard him use with me before. Mom, are you calling my wife a liar? The room went still. I looked at my son. He was looking at Simone. His hand was on her knee. I said, No, I'm telling you what I heard with my own ears. He said, I think you might have misunderstood the context. I stood up. I said goodnight. I went to my room. I did not cry that night. I lay in the dark and I thought about Darius at 11 years old, sitting on the porch steps the week after Marcus died, eating a bowl of cereal for dinner because neither of us could face cooking. He was so small, and I had kept him safe through everything. And now he was sitting in my living room defending the woman who had just called me territorial in my own house. That was not about Simone anymore. That was about my son, and that was the wound that stayed. I decided to try a different approach, not because I had given up, but because I still believed that if I removed the friction, things might settle on their own. I was still willing to give it a real try. I stopped commenting on anything. I let the reorganized shelves stay reorganized. I cooked when they were out, so there was no shared kitchen time to get tense. I left a pot of food on the stove for all of us without being asked and said nothing about it. One morning, I found Simone in the kitchen making coffee before I was up, and instead of retreating, I sat down and asked her how work was going. She looked a little surprised. We talked for almost 40 minutes about her job. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown, and she told me about a campaign she was running and a coworker she didn't trust. She was sharp. I'll give her that. She had a clear eye for what people were really doing underneath what they said they were doing. I thought, maybe we just needed the ice broken. Maybe the first weeks had been awkward and we turned it into a pattern that didn't have to stay. For 3 weeks, things were quieter. Then I came home from church on a Sunday afternoon. The back patio was completely different. Ornamental grass and low planters along the fence. Artificial turf rolled out over half the flagstone. A large propane grill assembled and already connected, sitting directly in the space where Marcus's lemon tree had stood in its pot for 11 years. The lemon tree was gone. I went back inside and looked around until I found it, squeezed behind the tool shed in full shade, already starting to look stressed. I found Darius in the kitchen. I did not raise my voice. I said, Darius, your father's lemon tree is behind the shed. He said, Simone bought a grill. She needed the space. I said, that tree has been on this patio for 11 years. He said, Mom, it's just a tree. Something cracked open behind my eyes. Not tears exactly. Something harder than that. Just a tree. His father's lemon tree. Just a tree. I went to get the tree myself. I carried the pot through the yard. It was heavy, maybe 40 pounds, and I brought it back to the patio. I set it where it belonged. When Simone came out and saw it, she looked at Darius. That look. The silent one that already knew what was coming. He said, Mom, we talked about this. I said, You did not talk to me about this. Simone turned toward me with a sigh that made me feel about 9 years old. Lorraine, Nobody keeps a lemon tree on a patio anymore. It's old-fashioned. The grill adds real value to the property. I said, "This is not your property." And Darius stood up from his chair, and the voice he used, the voice I'd heard once before, the Sunday night voice, came again. "Don't talk to my wife like that. She lives here too. She has every right to make it feel like home." I looked at my son for a long moment. I said nothing. I went inside. I went to my room, and I sat on the edge of Marcus's side of the bed, and I stayed very still for a long time. Then I got up and called Kevin. Kevin picked up on the second ring. He always does. I told him everything, from the beginning. The table, the kitchen, the balcony, the conversation I'd overheard, the confrontation that became a defense of Simone, the slow, quiet weeks I had tried, and now the lemon tree behind the shed. Kevin listened without interrupting. That's something he learned young, to let people finish. When I was done, he said, "Mom, how long has this been going on?" I said, "Since they moved in." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as true and not as me trying to start something." I said, "Go ahead." "I've watched Darius his whole life. He has never been able to sit with discomfort when a woman he loves is upset. He just absorbs their version of things. He doesn't mean to. He genuinely can't tell the difference between keeping the peace and losing himself." I said, "He yelled at me, Kevin, in my own house." Kevin said, "I know, and that's not okay. That has crossed a line." I said, "I don't know what to do." He said, "Mom, you know what to do. You've always known what to do. You just want someone to tell you it's all right." I was quiet. He said, "It's all right." We talked for another hour. He told me he loved me. He told me I had built that house, and I had earned every inch of it, and I had the right to decide who lived there and under what conditions. He told me that if he had been closer, he would have said something long before now. He told me that I was not imagining anything, I was not being territorial, and I was not the problem. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface. The table Marcus and I had bought at that estate sale. Still here, still mine. I made my decision. I called on a Monday morning, just after 7, when Darius's car had pulled out of the driveway. I used a company I had worked with years earlier when I needed the back door rekeyed after a key went missing. The man who came was named Carl. Solid, efficient, no small talk. I liked him immediately. I told him I needed every lock in the house changed. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Yes, ma'am," and got his kit. While he worked, I went through every room. I took the ornamental grass off the back patio and put it by the fence. I moved the lemon tree back where it belonged. I unstacked my herb pots and put them back along the railing in the sun. I brought the cacti back to their spots. I hung my old curtains, the cream-colored ones I had made myself, with a small eyelet detail along the hem, back in the living room. I took the metal blinds down and put them in the storage closet next to the wooden table. I went through the kitchen and put every pot and bowl and pan back in its proper place. I put my recipe tin back on the second shelf above the stove. Then I went down the hallway and took my family photos off the floor of the closet where they'd been moved to make room for a full-length mirror, and I hung them back where they'd been. Marcus and me at a church picnic, 1989. Kevin at his high school graduation. Darius at his. Me and my mother, the year she came to stay with us when her hip went bad. Our family, whole and present, back on the wall. Carl knocked on the doorframe of the hallway. "All done, ma'am. 4 locks." He handed me a set of 2 keys for each. I paid him, and I gave him a little extra. He looked around at the house as he was leaving, the curtains back up, the photos on the wall, and he said, "Whatever you're doing, It looks right. I said, It is. I sat down in my armchair with the lights on, and I waited. They got home a little before 6. I heard the car pull in. I heard the door close. I heard footsteps on the porch, the familiar sound of keys, and then nothing. Then the key again. A pause. Huh. Weird. Darius's voice, muffled through the door. My key isn't working. Then Simone's, slightly sharper. Let me try mine. Another pause. What? Darius. Something's wrong with the door. The knocking started light. Mom? You in there? The door won't open. I sat still. The lamp was on. Through the curtain they could see the light. Mom. More knocking. Mom, please open up. The lock's not working. I stood. I walked to the door. I did not open it. I said evenly through the door, The lock is working fine. I had it changed today. A long silence. Then Simone. I'm sorry. What did you say? I changed the locks. All 4 of them. A shorter silence. Then Simone's voice climbed. Rebecca. She used the wrong name in her panic. Lorraine. What kind of... Is this a joke? Open this door right now. Darius said, Mom, this isn't funny. Please open the door. I said, I'm not trying to be funny. I've decided that the people who live in this house need to be people who respect me. Since you've both shown me that you don't, you're no longer welcome here. Mom. Darius's voice had dropped. He sounded scared now, not angry. Mom, it's raining. Please. The rain had started quietly. I could hear it on the awning. I said, Darius, you have a good salary and you have savings. Get a hotel tonight. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Simone said something I won't repeat. Darius said, Mom, I can't believe you're doing this. I said, I know. Go somewhere warm. We'll talk tomorrow. I went back to my armchair. A few minutes later, I heard them arguing on the porch. Not the words, just the tone. Both of them sharp and tight. Then footsteps. The car starting. Headlights sweeping across my curtains. Then quiet. I sat in my house, in my chair, in the light. My photos on the wall, my curtains on the windows, my recipe tin on the shelf above the stove. I was shaking, not from fear, from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after you do the thing you've been building toward for months. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat back down, and for the first time since spring, I felt like myself. The tea was chamomile. I drank it slowly. Outside, the rain picked up. It came down steadily on the porch where they'd stood, on the garden, on the lemon tree back in its right place. I sat with the mug in both hands, and I listened to it. I want to tell you I felt nothing but righteous. But that would be a lie. What I felt was grief, not regret. I want to be clear about that. But grief. Because the boy I raised was out there somewhere in that rain, probably in some hotel parking lot arguing with his wife, and some part of that was my son. The one I had carried, fed, sat up with through fevers, watched graduate with a rolled diploma and a grin so wide it looked like it might break his face. That was my child out there, and the woman who had done everything she could to erase me had managed in the end to put him in the rain too. I did not go to the window. I did not check my phone. I sat with the grief and I let it be what it was. Grief, not instruction. It was telling me I loved my son. It was not telling me I was wrong. I called Kevin around 9. He picked up as always. I said, I did it. He said, how do you feel? I said, tired. Right, both. He said, get some sleep. Tomorrow starts the hard part. I said, I know. I slept that night. Really slept. The kind where you go down deep and don't hear anything until morning. I hadn't slept like that in months. Kevin called me early the next morning. 8:15. He said, I talked to Darius last night. I was quiet. He said, he called me from the hotel. He was upset. Mom, I told him. I told him everything you told me. I told him what I saw the times I visited, the way Simone ran that house, the way he went along with it. I told him what it looked like from the outside. I said, how did he take it? Kevin said, not great at first, but he listened. By the end, he wasn't defending anything. That mattered. That changed the conversation Darius and I were about to have before it even started. At 2:00, the doorbell rang. I looked out the window first. Darius, alone. He'd changed his clothes, but he had the look of someone who'd been awake since 3 a.m. Stubble coming in. His jacket not quite right, like he'd grabbed it without looking. I opened the door. He said, can I come in? I said, yes. We sat in the living room. He looked around at the photos on the wall, the cream curtains, the wooden table back in its place. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked. He said, Mom, I don't even know where to start. I said, start by listening. And he did. For the first time in months, he actually listened. I spoke for almost an hour, not screaming, not crying. I went through it the way you'd explain something important to someone who has been away and doesn't know the full picture, clearly, in order, with specifics. The table removed while I was at the doctor. The recipe tin moved twice. The kitchen reorganized so I couldn't reach my own pots. The conversation I overheard, word for word, the way he had asked me if I was calling his wife a liar. The quiet weeks I had tried, genuinely tried. And then the lemon tree behind the shed, his father's tree. When I got to the tree, Darius put his face in his hands. I said, I'm not telling you this to punish you. I'm telling you because you asked. He said, I didn't know about the tree. I swear I didn't know she moved it. I said, she didn't tell you because she knew you'd have to say something. He looked up at that. You think she knew it would bother me? I said, I think she was careful about what she lets you see. That landed somewhere in him. I watched it land. He said, Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't. He stopped. Tried again. I kept telling myself you were having trouble adjusting, that it was just 2 women in one house. I didn't want to see what was actually happening. I said, I know. That's the part that hurt most, not what Simone did, what you decided not to see. He cried then. My son, 42 years old, sitting in my living room crying like he was 11 again. And I sat across from him, and I did not move to comfort him immediately, because I needed him to feel the weight of it before I lifted any of it. That was hard. It was the hardest part of the whole thing. When he'd steadied himself, I said, I love you, Darius. You will always be welcome in this house, but I am not going back to how things were. You two need to find your own place, he said. What if Simone wants to apologize? What if she wants to change? I said, then I'll listen. But you still need your own place. That doesn't change. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. That, too, was new. A week passed. Darius called twice. I kept my answers short and consistent. We are not going backward. Find your own place. We will talk when you have. On the 8th day, the doorbell rang at 10:30 in the morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked out and saw Simone. She was alone. No Darius. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt and jeans and no makeup, and she looked like she had lost 5 pounds she didn't have to lose. She was holding a small cactus in a plastic nursery pot. I opened the door. I did not step back to let her in. Not yet. She said, Rebecca, wrong name again. Then she caught it. Lorraine, I'm sorry. Can I talk to you? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I stepped back. She came in. She looked at the room, the curtains, the photos, the table, and she didn't say anything about it. She sat where I pointed, On the sofa. I sat in my chair. She set the cactus on the cushion beside her, like she'd forgotten she was holding it. Then she picked it up and put it on the coffee table. I brought you this. I know you like plants. I didn't know what else to bring. I said, "What do you want to say, Simone?" She took a breath. I wanted to apologize for how I've been, for what I said to my friends, for all of it. I waited. An apology that arrives alone, early in the morning, without an audience, is different from the performed kind. I wanted to hear what she would say without Darius in the room to manage the temperature. She said, "After you changed the locks, Darius and I had a terrible fight, the worst we've ever had. He said things and I said things, and we said everything that had been building up. And somewhere in the middle of it, I heard myself trying to explain why everything I'd done was justified, and I couldn't. I kept starting sentences, and there was nowhere to take them. I said, 'Keep going.' She said, 'Darius told me things about you, about how you raised him and Kevin after Marcus died, about what you gave up. I knew the outline, but I didn't let it land.' She paused. 'I came into your house, and I acted like none of that mattered, like your history here was just decor I could swap out.' Her voice was unsteady, but she kept going. That mattered to me. She didn't stop to manage it. I said, 'Why? What were you actually trying to do?' She sat with that question longer than I expected. Finally, she said, 'I wanted to belong somewhere, and the way I knew how to do that was to take up space, control the space. I didn't know another way.' A pause. 'I still don't, really. But I'm trying to learn.' I looked at her for a while. I said, 'An apology in a grocery store cactus don't fix 6 months of what you did.' She said, 'I know.' I said, 'But I'm going to tell you what I need, and you're going to listen, and then I'll decide.' She nodded. I told her, 'This is my house. I decide what changes. If something's to be rearranged, you ask and you accept whatever I say. You do not talk about me to your friends in my living room. You do not move my belongings. You do not treat me like a piece of the house you're managing.' She said yes to each one. I said, 'Last thing. This is the only conversation of this kind we will ever have. If I feel disrespected in this house again, you leave. No warning, no second sit down. You leave.' She said, 'I understand.' I said, 'I need to meet with you and Darius together before I decide anything. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. Dress like you're coming to someone's home.' She stood. She looked steadier than when she came in. 'Thank you for letting me say it.' I said, 'I haven't decided anything yet.' She nodded and left. I sat with the small cactus on the coffee table for a long time. Then I moved it to the balcony, in the sun, near Marcus's. They were on time. That already told me something. Darius wore a collared shirt. Simone had her hair done and wore a blazer over a simple dress. They stood on the porch together, and when I opened the door, they did not rush in. I said, 'Come in.' We sat in the living room. I had made tea. I had set 3 cups. That was a small thing, but it meant something, and they both seemed to know it. I let Darius speak first. He said, 'Mom, I want you to know I've been thinking about everything. Not just since last week, all the way back through the months, and I have to own something I didn't want to own.' He looked at his hands. I saw more than I said I did. There were moments where I knew something was off, and I told myself it would smooth out. I told myself you were adjusting. But what I was really doing was protecting myself from having to step in, because stepping in would have made things uncomfortable. He looked up at me. 'That's not the man you raised me to be.' I said, 'No, it isn't.' He said, 'I'm sorry, Mom. I mean that.' I said, 'I know you do.' I turned to Simone. She sat straight, hands in her lap, waiting. I said, 'I'm going to ask you something, and I need the real answer, not the managed one.' She said, 'All right.' I said, 'Do you understand what you took from me? not the table or the curtains, what you actually took. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I think I made you feel like a stranger in your own life, like everything you'd built was just backdrop. She stopped, started again. And I made your son think of you as a problem to be managed. I know that's the part that actually broke something. She was right. That was the part. I said, good. Now listen to what I need from both of you. I went through my conditions again, with Darius present, and I added one, looking directly at him. When there is a disagreement between me and your wife, you do not automatically take a side. You listen to both of us. You be fair. Not because I'm your mother, but because that's what a decent person does. Darius said, I promise. I said, you can come back. Tomorrow. Come with your things. But understand that this is the last time we have this conversation. Both of them thanked me. Multiple times. I asked them to stop. When they were leaving, I asked Darius to wait on the porch for a moment. I stood with Simone in the entryway. I said, I've been watching how you move through the world. You don't really believe you belong anywhere. So you try to remake wherever you land. She looked surprised. Then still. I said, you belong in this family, not because Darius brought you in, but because you came to this door alone with a plant and told me the truth. That's enough to build on. But you have to let me be who I am here. You can't build a home in someone else's history by erasing it. You have to add to it. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't try to play it off. She said, I'll try. I really will. I said, I know. They moved back in the next day. It was not a clean, fresh start. I want to be honest about that. There were small moments of friction in the first weeks. A Saturday afternoon when Simone started cleaning the kitchen, a way that conflicted with how I had things arranged, and we both got quiet and short with each other before either of us managed to step back. A moment when Darius got a little defensive when I said something about dinner timing, and I watched him catch himself and recalibrate. These things happened, but they were handled differently. That was the difference. Simone started asking. It sounds small. It wasn't. Is it all right if I put this here? How do you usually do this? What's the easiest way to... It meant she was choosing to orient toward me instead of around me. That's a real thing. That costs something. And Darius stopped smoothing. When there was tension, he didn't rush to make it go away. He sat with it long enough to actually understand it. A few times he said, Mom, what's actually bothering you? And waited for the real answer instead of the polite one. About a month in, I found Simone in the living room with my old photo albums open on her lap. I stiffened. Old reflex. But she looked up and said immediately, I'm sorry, I should have asked. I saw them on the shelf and I said, it's all right. What are you looking at? She said, this one. She turned the album toward me. It was Marcus. Young, maybe 35, holding baby Darius, grinning like someone had just told him the best news of his life. She said, Darius has his smile. Exactly. I sat beside her. I told her about that day, a Sunday after church, Marcus in his good shirt, holding Darius for the first time without looking nervous. I told her he used to say Darius laughed like someone who had never heard a sad story. I told her Marcus died before either of his boys were fully grown, and that this had been the grief I carried for almost 30 years. Simone listened in a way she hadn't before, not politely, actually listened. When I finished, she said, Thank you for telling me. I said, You're part of this family. You should know where it came from. It came out one afternoon in November. We were sitting on the back porch, just the two of us, Darius at the office, with coffee. It had started to get cold, but neither of us had moved inside yet. Simone said, Can I tell you something about why I was the way I was? I said, Go ahead. She said, my parents split up when I was 7, and after that it was just moving, different houses, different schools. My mom did her best, but she was surviving. There was no sitting around the table, no photos on the wall. I didn't grow up with any of that. I said, that's hard for a child. She said, what it made me was, I don't know. I never believed places were mine, so I either didn't attach or I tried to take over because taking over felt like the same as belonging. She wrapped both hands around her mug. When I came here and saw how much history was in every corner, your photos, your curtains, your plants, I felt it like a wall, like there was no room for me inside all of that. I said, so you tried to remove some of it? She said, yes, and that was wrong. I know it was wrong, but that's what it came from. I said, I won't say the why doesn't matter because it does. But the why doesn't change what you did. She said, I know. I said, what it does is tell me something I didn't know before, and it makes me want to. I stopped, chose the word carefully. Add to things, instead of protect them so hard. She looked at me. What do you mean? I said, I mean, maybe some of those shelves were so packed with the past that there was no room to breathe. Not much, but some. I looked out at the garden. A home isn't a museum. It shouldn't be. We sat with that for a while. Then I said, I don't know what you missed growing up, but I know what a family can look like when it works. You're in one now. Let it show you. Simone didn't say anything. She just nodded, slowly, and kept her eyes on the garden. That was enough. 6 months after the lock change. 6 months, which is not a long time and also feels like years when you've lived a lot inside it. They made dinner. A real dinner. Darius cooked, which was a production because Darius treats cooking the way he treats most important things, seriously and with too many dishes. Simone set the table, the good plates. She asked me which placemats I wanted, which I noticed. After dinner, Simone brought out a dessert, pound cake from my own recipe. She'd asked me for it 2 weeks earlier, said she wanted to try it. I'd assumed she'd lose interest. She had not lost interest. It was good. Not exactly like mine, but close, and the effort was in every bite. Darius said, Mom, we have something to tell you. I set down my fork. He said, we found an apartment. We signed the lease yesterday. I felt 2 things at the same time, immediately, sadness and pride. The sadness surprised me a little. They were leaving, and something in me would miss the sounds of them in the house, even knowing how much I had needed my house back. I said, tell me about it. Simone said, it's close, about 10 minutes. 2nd floor, good natural light, a little garden plot in the back that comes with the unit. She paused. I want to grow things. You've been teaching me without either of us saying that's what you were doing. I smiled. Darius said, but Mom, there's more. He and Simone looked at each other. That particular look, sideways, soft, the kind that has a whole conversation in it. He said, Simone's pregnant. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something large enters them. I could not speak for a moment. I just looked at her, at them, and my throat closed with the kind of feeling that has no short name. My grandchild, a whole new person coming into the family I had held together through everything. I got up from my chair and I hugged my son. Then I hugged Simone, and she held on a beat longer than I expected. When I stepped back, her eyes were wet. Darius said, we want you there from the beginning, Mom, for all of it. Simone said, and if it's a girl, she stopped. Try it again. We want to name her Lorraine. I sat back down. I needed to sit. I said, that is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. They moved out in February on a cold, clear Saturday. Darius made 3 trips in the truck. Simone wrapped her kitchen things carefully in paper, the way I'd shown her. I helped carry boxes. Darius kept telling me to leave the heavy ones. I ignored him. When the last load was in the truck, he stood in the driveway and looked at the house. He said, "I grew up here." I said, "And now you're building somewhere." He hugged me for a long time. Neither of us said much. Simone, 5 months along by then, just starting to show under her coat, came and put her arms around both of us. "Sunday lunch is at ours," she said, "and Wednesday dinner's here. Deal?" I said, "Deal." I watched them drive away. Then I went back inside, my house, my curtains, my plants in their proper places, including Marcus's lemon tree on the patio, which had put out 2 new leaves in the spring. My recipe tin on the shelf above the stove. I made myself coffee, and I sat in my chair and I listened to the quiet. 3 months later, I'm at their place on a Sunday in May. Simone is 8 months along and moving more carefully now, with that particular gravity that late pregnancy brings. She's made roast chicken, from scratch, with the herbs she grew in her garden plot out back. She started those plants herself. She called me twice for advice about soil. Darius is doing the dishes. He puts on music when he does dishes, just like Marcus used to. I'm on the sofa, feet up, coffee in hand, in their home. A home that has photos on the wall, a whole section of them near the front door. Their wedding photo, courthouse plain and grinning. A photo of Marcus Young, which Simone asked me for and framed herself. A photo of Kevin's kids at Christmas, and one of me and Simone that Darius took on the porch one afternoon in November, both of us looking out at the garden. Neither of us posed. He just took it. I hadn't seen it printed and framed until today. I stood in front of it for a while. Simone came up beside me. She said, "No. Do you like it?" I said, "I do." She said, "You look like yourself in it." I said, "That's because I was." She smiled. Then she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what to call her." I looked at her. She said, "Lorraine is the legal name, but we want to call her something at home, something that feels like hers." She paused. "What did people call you when you were little?" I said, "Raina. My mother called me Raina." Simone said, "Raina." She turned it over, said it again. "Raina." She nodded slowly, placed her hand on her stomach. She said, "That's her." I looked at my daughter-in-law, which is what she is, but not all she is, not anymore. And I thought about the morning she came to my door with the grocery store cactus and ran out of reasons to keep pretending. I thought about Marcus saying, "Don't spend your anger until you know what you're buying." I thought about the lemon tree on the patio with its 2 new leaves. I thought about what it took to change those locks. The shaking hands, the quiet tea, the long dark night after. I thought about how I almost didn't. Almost opened the door. Almost said it was fine. I'm glad I didn't. Some things don't grow unless you make room for them. And sometimes making room means standing firm in the middle of your own life and saying, "This is mine, and I know what it's worth, and I will not be moved." Baby Raina is going to grow up knowing her grandmother's name. She's going to grow up in a house with photos on the wall and herbs in the garden, and a grandmother 10 minutes away who will teach her everything she asked to learn. That's enough. That is more than enough. That's family. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.